I never thought I'd become the kind of woman I used to judge. My name is Samantha Fisher, and I'm 31 years old. I worked at St. Agnes Medical Center in Portland, Oregon, for 6 years before everything fell apart, before I destroyed 3 lives, including my own. And the worst part is that I saw it coming. I felt every step pulling me deeper into something I knew was wrong. But I couldn't stop myself, because when you're drowning in loneliness, you'll grab onto anything that feels like air, even if it's poison. It started on a Tuesday in late September, when they wheeled Caroline Mitchell into the oncology ward. She was 43 years old, with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and the kind of gentle smile that made you want to cry, because you knew she wouldn't be smiling much longer. Her husband David was with her, tall and tired-looking, with salt and pepper hair, and these deep blue eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in months. He held her hand the entire intake process, and I remember thinking, that's what love looks like when it's being tested. That's the kind of devotion I'd been searching for my entire adult life. I'd been single for 2 years, after my ex-fiancé Marcus left me for his coworker 3 weeks before our wedding. He said I was too focused on my career, too emotionally unavailable, too everything that wasn't enough for him. And maybe he was right, because after that I threw myself into nursing. Double shifts and overnight rotations became my life. The hospital became my home. And sick people became the only relationships I could handle, because they needed me in a way that was clear and measurable and temporary. Caroline's treatment plan was aggressive. Chemotherapy 3 times a week, radiation therapy, experimental drug trials that made her violently sick. And through it all, David was there, every single day, from morning until the nurses kicked him out at night. He'd read to her from mystery novels. He'd play her favorite jazz music on his phone. He'd hold a basin when she vomited and wipe her mouth with the tenderness of someone touching something sacred. I found myself assigned to Caroline's care more and more, partly because I requested it, and partly because she liked me. She said I had kind hands. The first time I really talked to David alone was in the family waiting room on a Thursday afternoon in October. Caroline was sleeping after a particularly brutal chemo session, and he was sitting there with his head in his hands, looking like a man who'd forgotten how to hold himself together. I sat down next to him with 2 cups of terrible hospital coffee and said something stupid like, "You need to take care of yourself too." He looked at me with those exhausted blue eyes and laughed. Not a happy laugh, but the kind that sounds like breaking glass. He said, "How am I supposed to take care of myself when the only person who ever really knew me is dying?" That's when I learned they'd been married for 18 years. High school sweethearts who got married at 25. No children, because Caroline had endometriosis, and they'd tried for years before accepting it wasn't going to happen. He was a civil engineer who designed bridges. She was an elementary school teacher who loved her students like they were her own. They had a small house in the suburbs with a garden she could no longer tend, and a golden retriever named Biscuit, who didn't understand why his mom wasn't coming home. And as David talked, I felt something shift inside my chest, something dangerous and warm and completely inappropriate. I started staying later than my shifts required, checking on Caroline when I should have been clocking out, bringing David sandwiches from the cafeteria because I noticed he wasn't eating. We'd talk in those quiet evening hours when the hospital felt like a church, hushed and holy, and separate from the normal world. He told me about the trip to Italy they'd planned for their 20th anniversary, about the bridges he was designing that would outlive him, about how scared he was to imagine a future where Caroline's voice wasn't the first thing he heard in the morning, and I listened like I was collecting pieces of him, storing them away in some locked room in my heart. Caroline got worse in November. The cancer spread to her liver and lungs. The doctors gave her 2 months, maybe 3, if she was lucky. She spent most days sleeping or in pain. And the Caroline who smiled at intake became a shadow who whimpered and begged for morphine. David started to crumble. I could see it happening in real time. The way his shoulders curved inward. The way his voice got quieter. The way he'd sit in her room for hours, just watching her breathe, like he was trying to memorize the pattern. And I wanted so badly to fix it, to fix him, to be the person who could make any of this bearable. The night it happened was December 3rd. I remember because it was the first snow of the season, and the hospital windows were covered in frost that looked like lace. Caroline had been unconscious for 2 days, her breathing shallow and rattling. David hadn't left her room in 36 hours, and I could smell the grief on him, sharp and sour, like something rotting. I convinced him to take a walk with me, told him he needed fresh air. We ended up in the parking garage, on the 5th floor, where you could see the city lights blinking through the snow. He broke down completely, just fell apart, like a building with no foundation, crying these horrible gasping sobs that echoed off the concrete. And I did what any compassionate nurse would do. I held him. I let him collapse against me. I stroked his hair and whispered that it was okay to fall apart. But then something shifted. His face was against my neck, and I could feel his breath, hot and desperate, against my skin. And when he pulled back to look at me, his eyes weren't just sad anymore. They were searching, looking for something to hold on to that wasn't death and wasn't loss. And I knew I should step away. I knew I should maintain that professional boundary. But instead, I kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, like we were both testing whether this was real or just a fever dream born from exhaustion and despair. But then it deepened and became something urgent and hungry. His hands were in my hair, and my back was against someone's car. And for those few minutes, we weren't a grieving husband and a lonely nurse. We were just 2 people trying to remember what it felt like to be alive. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, the cold air turning our breath into ghosts between us. And the first thing he said was, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I can't do this. My wife is dying upstairs." The guilt hit me like a physical thing, like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart until it burst. I told him it was my fault, that I'd crossed a line, that we should pretend it never happened. He nodded and practically ran back inside, and I stood there in the parking garage for 20 minutes, trying to figure out what kind of person I'd become. I'd kissed a man whose wife was dying in a hospital bed 4 floors above us. I'd taken advantage of his grief and vulnerability. I'd violated every ethical principle I'd ever sworn to uphold. And the worst part was that even through all that shame, I could still feel the ghost of his lips on mine, and I wanted more. I should have requested a transfer off Caroline's case. I should have avoided David completely. I should have done 1,000 things differently, but I didn't. Instead, I kept showing up to her room, kept bringing him coffee, kept having those long conversations in the dark hours of the night. We didn't kiss again, But the air between us was electric, charged with all the things we weren't saying. Every accidental touch felt like fire. Every look lasted too long. Caroline slipped in and out of consciousness and had no idea that her husband and her nurse were betraying her in the worst possible way. She died on December 18th at 3:47 in the morning. I was there when it happened. David was holding her left hand and I was holding her right, monitoring her vitals as they slowly declined. Her last breath was so quiet you could barely hear it. Just a small exhale, and then nothing. The monitor flatlined and played that single, terrible tone. That means a life has ended. David made a sound I'll never forget. Something between a scream and a moan, completely inhuman. And I had to walk him through the process of letting go of her hand, of stepping back so the doctor could pronounce her dead, of signing papers and collecting her personal effects. I held him in the hallway while he sobbed, and this time it felt different. There was no electric charge, no forbidden heat, just raw grief and the terrible knowledge that the obstacle between us was gone. Caroline was gone, which meant the thing that made our attraction wrong was no longer there. Or at least, that's what I told myself in those first numb days after her death. I went to the funeral, told myself it was to pay respects, but really, I wanted to see David. The service was at a Methodist church in Northeast Portland, small and intimate with maybe 50 people. I sat in the back and watched David stand at the front, looking hollowed out. He gave a eulogy about how Caroline was the best person he'd ever known, how she taught him what love meant, how he'd spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of the time they'd had together. And I felt like the worst person alive, because part of me was already imagining what it would be like when enough time had passed, when it would be appropriate for him to move on, when I could be the one to help him heal. He called me 3 weeks later on a Thursday night in January. I was at home in my small apartment in the Pearl District, watching television and trying not to think about him. His voice on the phone was rough and uncertain. He said he'd been thinking about me, that he couldn't stop thinking about me, that he knew it was too soon and completely inappropriate, but he needed to see me. And I should have said no. I should have told him he was grieving and confused, that what he felt wasn't real, but just a trauma response. Instead, I gave him my address. He showed up an hour later with a bottle of wine and eyes that looked like open wounds. We sat on my couch and talked for hours about Caroline, about his guilt, about how empty his house felt without her, about how the only time he'd felt anything besides pain in the last 4 months was that night in the parking garage when he'd kissed me. And then we were kissing again, harder this time, desperate and messy. And I led him to my bedroom, knowing full well that this was wrong on every conceivable level. His wife had been dead for less than a month. I'd been her nurse. I'd held her hand while she died. But I wanted him so badly that I could ignore all of that. I could pretend that this was okay, that this was just two broken people finding comfort in each other. That night became a pattern. He'd come over 2 or 3 times a week, always late, always with that same haunted look in his eyes. We'd have sex that felt more like mutual self-destruction than intimacy, rough and silent, except for the sounds of breathing and skin against skin. Afterward, he'd lie next to me and talk about Caroline, about their life together, about how he felt like he was betraying her memory, but couldn't stop himself. And I'd hold him and tell him it was okay, that grief was complicated, that he deserved to feel something besides pain. All the while knowing I was the worst kind of predator, feeding on his vulnerability. I convinced myself I was falling in love with him, that this was something real and meaningful, not just a trauma bond wrapped in sex and shame. I started imagining a future, maybe in a year or two, when enough time had passed, we could be public. We could be a real couple. His friends and family would understand that sometimes love comes from unexpected places, that I'd helped him through the darkest period of his life, that Caroline would want him to be happy. I created this entire fantasy while ignoring the reality that I was a secret he kept hidden, that he never took me anywhere public, that he'd leave my apartment at 2 a.m. and go home to sleep in the bed he'd shared with his dead wife. The first crack in my delusion came in March, when I ran into David at a coffee shop in Northwest Portland. I was getting coffee before a shift, and I saw him through the window, sitting at a table with a blonde woman who was laughing at something he'd said. They looked comfortable together, familiar, and when he saw me, his face went completely white. He came outside and explained that she was his sister-in-law, Caroline's younger sister, Jennifer, who'd been helping him sort through Caroline's things. And I wanted to believe him, but something in his voice sounded wrong, too defensive, too quick to explain. I started paying attention after that, started noticing things I'd been deliberately ignoring, the way he never answered his phone when he was with me, the way he'd never let me call him, the way he kept our relationship completely compartmentalized from every other aspect of his life. I told myself this was normal for someone in his position, that he needed time before going public. But doubt had planted itself in my mind, and it grew like cancer, fast and poisonous and impossible to ignore. In April, I did something I'm not proud of. I drove past his house in the suburbs, the house he'd shared with Caroline. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I wasn't working. I told myself I just wanted to see where he lived, to make the connection between the man in my bed and the man who existed in the real world. His car was in the driveway, along with a blue Honda I didn't recognize. And as I sat there in my car, parked 3 houses down, trying to decide if I should leave, I saw them, David and the blonde woman Jennifer, coming out of his front door. She was wearing one of his sweaters. It hung loose on her small frame, and he had his arm around her waist, not like a brother-in-law comforting his dead wife's sister, but like a man with his girlfriend. I watched them get into her car and drive away. I watched my entire fantasy crumble into dust. I sat there for 2 hours trying to make sense of what I'd seen, trying to find an innocent explanation, but there wasn't one. The way he touched her, the way she'd looked at him, the casual intimacy of her wearing his clothes, all of it pointed to the truth I'd been avoiding. I wasn't the person helping David heal. I was just a convenient body, a nurse who'd been there at the right time, someone he could use and discard without consequence. When he came over that night, I confronted him, asked him directly if he was seeing Caroline's sister. The look on his face told me everything, before he even opened his mouth. Guilt and anger, and something like relief, like he was glad he didn't have to keep lying. He admitted they'd been together since February, that it had started when she was helping him clean out Caroline's closet, that they'd both been grieving and it just happened. He said it with that same justification he'd used about us, like pain was an excuse for any behavior, like suffering gave him permission to hurt people. I asked him what I was then, what this had been, and he had the audacity to look confused, like he genuinely didn't understand why I was upset. He said, I knew what this was, that we'd never talked about being exclusive, that he'd never promised me anything. And technically, he was right. We'd never defined our relationship, but that was because I'd assumed the intimacy meant something. I'd assumed the hours of conversation and the vulnerability and the sex added up to something real. I'd been so desperate for connection that I'd created an entire relationship in my head that didn't exist in reality. I told him to leave and he did. No argument, no fight for me, just a sad look and a quiet goodbye. And I sat on my bathroom floor until sunrise, trying to understand how I'd gotten here, how I'd become a woman who slept with grieving widowers, who betrayed dying patients, who was stupid enough to fall in love with a man who'd never seen her as anything more than a warm body to distract him from his pain. The really pathetic part was that I still wanted him, even knowing about Jennifer, even knowing I'd been used. I spent weeks checking my phone, hoping he'd call, playing out scenarios in my head where he'd realize I was the one he really wanted, that Jennifer was just a rebound, that what we had was special, but he never called. And slowly, the wanting turned into something else, something darker and more corrosive. I started to hate him, not the passionate hate that comes from betrayal, but the cold, calculated hate that comes from humiliation. I started thinking about Jennifer, about how she had no idea her dead sister's husband was sleeping with her dead sister's nurse, about how David was doing to her exactly what he'd done to me, building a relationship on the foundation of Caroline's death, using grief as foreplay. And I wondered if Jennifer knew what kind of man she was with, if she knew how quickly he'd moved on, how easily he'd betrayed Caroline's memory, and I realized I had information that could destroy their relationship, that could make David feel even a fraction of the humiliation I felt. I spent 2 months planning, not because the act itself was complicated, but because I needed to be sure I wanted to do this, that I was willing to accept the consequences. I thought about Caroline, about the trust she'd placed in me, about how she'd smiled at me and called my hands kind, about how I'd violated everything she'd believed about human decency. And I realized that telling Jennifer the truth wasn't just about hurting David. It was about Caroline. It was about making sure someone knew what had been done to her, how little her death had meant to the two people who should have honored her memory most. I found Jennifer on social media. She was a pediatric dentist with an office in Beaverton, pretty in that wholesome way that made you trust her immediately. Her profile was full of pictures with David, hiking at Multnomah Falls, having dinner at fancy restaurants downtown, looking happy and in love. And every photo felt like a knife, because that should have been me. I should have been the one in those pictures, the one he was proud to show the world. But instead, I'd been the dirty secret, the mistake he'd hidden in dark apartments and late-night hours. I sent her a message on a Sunday afternoon in June. Kept it simple and direct. I explained who I was, that I'd been Caroline's primary nurse, that I needed to talk to her about something important regarding David. She responded within an hour, asking what this was about, and I told her it would be better to meet in person. She agreed to meet me at a coffee shop in downtown Portland the following Tuesday. She showed up nervous, wearing a blue sundress and sandals, looking younger than her 39 years. We sat outside on the patio where no one could overhear us, and I ordered us both iced coffee. I knew neither of us would drink. She asked me what this was about, and I could see she already suspected. Women always know on some level when something is wrong. They just need someone to confirm it. I told her everything about the kiss in the parking garage while Caroline was dying upstairs, about the months of sleeping with David after Caroline's death, about how he'd told me she was just his sister-in-law when really they were together. I watched her face cycle through emotions: disbelief, horror, disgust, pain. She started crying quietly, tears running down her face while she stayed completely still. And I felt powerful in a way I'd never felt before, like I'd taken back some small piece of what had been stolen from me. She asked me why I was telling her this, what I wanted, and I told her the truth, that I wanted her to know who she was with, that David was the kind of man who'd use anyone's pain for his own comfort, that he'd done it to me and he'd do it to her, that Caroline deserved better than both of us, but at least we could stop pretending any of this was okay. She sat there for a long time, just staring at her untouched coffee. Then she said thank you for telling me and walked away. I don't know what happened after that conversation. If Jennifer confronted David, if they broke up, if she forgave him. I blocked both of them on every platform and deleted their numbers from my phone. I requested a transfer to a different hospital, got a job at Legacy Emmanuel across town, started seeing a therapist who specialized in moral injury, the kind of psychological damage that comes from violating your own ethical code. My therapist asked me once if I felt like I'd gotten what I wanted by telling Jennifer, if destroying David's relationship had made me feel better. And I had to admit that it hadn't. I'd thought exposing him would give me closure, that his suffering would somehow balance out mine. But instead, I just felt empty, like I'd burned down a building I was still standing inside. I'd wanted him to hurt the way I'd hurt, but hurting him meant acknowledging that I'd cared, that I'd invested emotion in something that was never real, and that was somehow worse than the original betrayal. The worst part is that I know I did this to myself. David never lied to me about what he was feeling. I just heard what I wanted to hear. I took his grief and loneliness and repackaged it as love, because I was so desperate to be chosen by someone. I betrayed Caroline, not because David was worth it, but because I'd convinced myself that being wanted by a grieving man was better than not being wanted at all. And that's a truth I'll have to carry for the rest of my life. I think about Caroline sometimes, about the woman I was supposed to protect and honor. I wonder if she knew somehow, in those last days, if she could feel the thing growing between her husband and her nurse, if she died knowing she'd been betrayed by the two people she should have been able to trust most. And I hope she didn't. I hope she died still believing in the goodness of people, in the sanctity of her marriage, in the professionalism of her medical care, because she deserved that peace, even if we didn't deserve to give it to her. 6 months after I told Jennifer, I ran into David at a grocery store in Southeast Portland. He was alone pushing a cart through the produce section, looking older than I remembered. Our eyes met across a display of apples, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then he turned around and walked away. No acknowledgement, no confrontation, just a man pretending he'd never met me. And I realized that was all I'd ever been to him. Someone easy to forget, someone who'd served a purpose and then became inconvenient. And maybe that's the cruelest thing. Not that he'd used me, but that I'd been so easy to use. I'm 31 years old, and I've learned that compassion without boundaries is just another word for self-destruction. That loneliness can make you compromise every value you thought was unshakable. That the line between helping someone and hurting yourself is thinner than you'd ever imagine. I ruined my own life trying to be someone's salvation, and the man I destroyed myself for walked away without looking back. So now I live with it, with the knowledge of what I'm capable of when I'm desperate enough. And I make sure I'm never that desperate again. The real pain isn't the betrayal or the humiliation. It's knowing that somewhere in Portland, there's a dead woman whose memory I desecrated, whose husband I slept with while her body was still warm, whose trust I violated in the worst possible way. Caroline Mitchell died, believing her husband loved only her, and her nurse was a good person. And I let her die with those lies, because the truth would have killed her faster than the cancer. And I have to live with that, with the knowledge that my weakness and loneliness and desperate need to be loved made me the villain in a story where I should have been the hero. And there's no redemption from that, no way to make it right, just the endless weight of carrying forward, knowing what you've done and who you've become.